Hello guys, welcome back to Rise Tales, The Last Adventurous. This is the 17th story. This is Sentenced Prism. So, this is a very odd one to go on from. Let's get to it. So, the ship collides with a black star out of nowhere, and the protagonists are flung into this labyrinth-type world, and they don't know where they are. They're totally out. It's outside of a different universe. This is like another world they've entered in. The collision has caused them to end up somewhere totally different indeed. So it's like dark, misty corridors of this labyrinth. So they don't know whether. So they end up in there first. Then afterwards they have to withstand a couple of things. The first thing, of course, is actually being born again, trapped in a woman's womb, which is somehow get through. It's just, and it's really the woman in particular. If you, in the story, is very sort of like massive, bulging, like a balloon type woman in a way, a bit like the wife in Pink Floyd's The Wall. Very much in that sort of way, that sort of surrealist jowled scarf look of it. They end up getting born out of that, and then that leads to this little colourful sex dungeon, which is not owned by Mr. Pike, who's a clown, who also owns a sponge cake factory as well. But this is like on top is this sponge cake factory. So to believe down below is this weird sex dungeon, really, to be honest, like torture sex dungeon, and he's just completely like, yes, very creepy sort of clown, very misogynistic type clown in there. And it's like, oh god. And they basically just escape really from away from him by trying to whip them to death. It's like, god, strange. And then then this leads to a crystal pitch, a pitch like a field pitch made of crystal. And they have to play some dangerous games, of course, like mind games, that sort of thing, and just try and get to the crux of it. In actual fact, where they've ended up is in the mind of a girl called Henrietta St. Bartholomew, who is it's from the early 20th century. So this is like the early 1900s, really. And she's a tortured little soul, has dark thoughts and anything else, and she's manifested this surreal world in her head, of course. And it comes to be like the actual the black star in particular is actually it's not really a black star. They say it's a black star. They say it's a black star, or Florence says it's a black star, but it's actually a little portal, like a little dimension sucking thing, of course. And they end up in the mind of Henrietta St. Bartholomew. In her head, they end up in a mind. They do. And it's like, and she's like, and there's points in her bed like she's possessed or something by a demon or something. And she's like screaming. She screams that she's saying, get out of my head and everything else. Like while she's in bed or staring at a mirror or just staring at the ceiling and everything else. And her parents think she needs an exorcism or something, really, to banish a demon out of her. In actual fact, she's got a few characters wandering around her brain, just interrupting her fantasy land, really, that sort of thing. There's some weird stuff as well, surreal stuff, like in terms of everything else. It's completely mad. It's completely bonkers, really, and they eventually get out of it. She imagines, of course, they speak to her through her conscience, and they speak to her through to get a little portal just to free them, and then they're back in their own place, of course. In actual fact, their own place, it might have suggested, like she suggested, back in your own time, back where you lot really originate from. It's like, and they say, no, we don't go back there. We don't want to bring it. We don't want to bring you back there. Just bring us back to a little tiny police box stuck in space, and that's really about it. And she sort of lives on and lives happy with her family and grows older, of course. And she ends up writing those short stories to do with these little characters, of course, that are inside her head. Making it a bit more kid friendly, a bit more interesting, a bit more whimsical and everything else. You think she envisions those characters in her head. It's like, I'll put them to paper and draw them herself. illustrates them herself, writes herself, and she ends up doing a couple of interesting little books, of course, until she passes away. At the age of 101, you know, and that's like, yeah, interesting. So, Sentenced to Prism. So this story was another one of those fan stories I actually written at the time. They had a few titles listed. So the first time was called Mordia Brewing. It was called. Mordia is actually the place where in Henrietta's mind. That's her place. A fantasy world is called Mordia. So that's where it comes from. Really, that title, and I thought that'd be interesting. I think originally it was meant to be like sort of like more swashbuckled knights in armor and everything else, but it eventually drafted into this story. He also adopted a second title called Through an Hourglass Darkly, which I thought which stuck for most of the time actually, but until when I was working on when I was sort of finalising it, I changed it to Sentenced to Prism, which is based on a painting it is. I think like a surreal landscape painting, I think it was. So I thought, that'll fit, really. So Sentenced to Prism is like that, really. It doesn't make sense, really, the title, really. But Mordia Brewing does, because it's of what it is. Through an Hourglass Darkly, it's like, that could be a very surreal title. And that was originally meant to be the title, but it was never been used, of course. So yeah, so I had this for a while, of course. You can obviously tell it's very influenced by the Mind Rubber. You know, like a very sort of surreal, nasty version of the Mind Rubber. In a way, more surreal, a bit more harsher as well, in terms of places, a bit more surreal, a bit more adult as well. So it sort of fits perfectly, you know. You kind of think, could Conundrum or Head Games be like that? Well, no, not really. You know, but if I did something like that, it would probably be just like, whoa. It's like, oh my god. It's like, you know, you basically tipping the land of fiction on its head, really. But in this case, it's something called Mordia, someone else's own land of fiction, really. And it does nicely. It does. It's really one of the more out there. It's a very out there. It's an out there story. I coin it as an out there story because it's in this world that's out of, you know, it's not in a time or a place or a planet or on Earth or anything. It's in its own little thing. It's like its own little world. And you can get, and there's a couple of stories like that as well along the line, which I'll get to, you know, in a couple many videos time, really, because there's only a couple of this sort of nature, not many, just a couple, and yeah, it's just a very interesting surreal experience, really. And some of it actually originates, well, Henry S. and Bartholomew, along with the Crystal Pitch, Mr. Pike, and also the Mother's Womb as well, that sort of originated from a concept album that I sort of worked on, really. So, well, sort of ideas for the psychedelic adventures of Henry St. Bartholomew. That was the thing. So it was a music project to begin with, and I sort of implemented it into the story very much. So everything else that sort of continued here. I think it was just I think it's just like a concept album of this little girl just experiencing some real surreal hellish imagery, really, and that sort of thing. But it's really interesting. I thought it was pretty good, and I thought, why not? And that's really about it with Sentenced to Prism. It's a really good story, really interesting story, and I thought, why not talk about it? And it's also worth including into the main line. Thank you guys for watching, as always. See you for the next video, and goodbye.